Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In our last video, we talked about the Scout Trooper and the psyche behind these goofball specialists who like riding speeder bikes around. In the video, we talked about the EC-17 holdout blaster, which is kind of like the primary weapon used by these scouts. We briefly mentioned just how shoddy of a weapon this was, at which point the gears in my head started slowly turning, and I realized, well hey, this is a sci-fi fantasy franchise. That means the creators in Star Wars are able to make some truly interesting and creative weapons. And while I always appreciate out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to creating new things, new gadgets, and all sorts of things, I also realize that there are a lot of misses in Star Wars. A lot of weapons that just make no sense. And so that's what today's video is going to be about. We're going to take a look at some of the dumbest weapons in all of Star Wars. The EC-17 holdout blaster from Blastag Industries might seem like a pretty standard weapon, very similar to other weapons of this class. Generally, holdout blasters are all about concealment, and so they really skip a lot of the creature comforts you usually find on a blaster, like a comfortable grip, barrel attachments like flash suppressors or compensators, or just a barrel. Like the Derringers of old or the MIB Little Cricket, the EC-17 actually packs quite a punch in way too small of a package, and so there's going to be a lot of kick to contend with this weapon. Now, in a lot of ways, the EC-17 holdout blaster is perfect for a scout trooper, especially one that's riding a bike. I mean, these things can be holstered in your boot, basically. We've seen scout troopers use this weapon when flying parallel alongside other speeder bikes. Their main cannon cannot fire off-board, but the EC-17 definitely can. Now, when you're choosing a weapon for when you're flying a speeder, well, it has to be something that's very easy to use because you really can't take off both hands when you're trying to reach for that weapon. Ideally, you only need one hand. And so the idea here is creating a weapon that can go from your holster into your hand, be activated or turned on, safety off, and fired all in one quick motion. I mean, that's why sawed-off shotguns are often portrayed as the ultimate biker weapon. Unlike a pistol that usually needs to be cocked before firing, all you have to do here is pull a trigger. Now, the EC-17 doesn't need to be activated or cocked, and more interestingly, because of the thick biker gloves worn by scout troopers and how clumsy it makes their fingers, this weapon actually does not feature a traditional trigger at all. Now, in Legends, this weapon actually has a pressure-sensitive grip, and a trooper is supposed to fit two of their glove fingers through that trigger guard in order to fire it, which actually is not the worst design. I mean, it's an unorthodox design for a trigger, but I guess like squeezing your hand and squeezing the trigger isn't all that different. But then I found that in canon, these blasters are actually built a bit differently. It actually states that these triggers are on the side of the weapon, and instead of a trigger, you have a button. This is just completely idiotic because you're literally pushing the weapon to the side each time you're doing your firing motion, which just makes this thing, which is already pretty inaccurate, now super inaccurate. Look, I'm no gun expert, but I occasionally go to the range, and even I know that the way you pull your trigger, nice and smooth, that jerking the barrel in any direction is really the key to being an accurate shooter. It's probably the thing that you should work on the most. This design basically throws all of that out the window. I mean, no wonder these scout troopers who are supposed to be expert marksmen can't hit anything with this weapon. But I guess in a pinch, at extremely close ranges, it could be useful. But still, a button? What were they thinking? Once upon a time, the Jedi were as warlike as they came. In the old Jedi-Sith wars, when thousands of Force users populated the battlefield, the Jedi really were pushed to the limits of their ability, and so they resorted to some pretty crazy methods. Like, why haven't we seen this period of time in live action? It would be completely awesome. Not that child soldiers are ever a good thing. I mean, even if you are trying to target a younger audience with your franchise, George. No! But yeah, things used to be a lot more messed up for Jedi younglings. Anyway, during this golden age of Jedi violence, they created this beauty of a weapon, the lightsaber rifle. The Jedi philosophy when it comes to killing is all about making the action quite difficult and personal. We've talked a lot about how lightsabers channel the force energy of the user, and so when a lightsaber blade strikes flesh, it's a really intimate, connected feeling. Gross. But this connection, it does make killing harder, and I guess that's the whole point, right? The Jedi are supposed to be peacekeepers, not executioners. Now, the lightsaber rifle makes killing hard because the ammunition for this weapon is ridiculous. It literally takes lightsabers and then uses the kyber crystals inside to fire a massive destructive beam. That is very un-Jedi-like. And after just 5 shots, this weapon melts the lightsaber that you're using for ammunition. This weapon could also be instructed to self-destruct. Look, I really think the lightsaber rifle is one of the coolest weapons in Star Wars, but if you're going to use lightsabers, precious lightsabers as ammunition, then that's just a dumb design. It makes no sense. There's a class of weapon in Star Wars that I just don't get. I don't understand why people use this thing. We see Omega use one, and more importantly, the Night Sisters adopt Mir. We're talking about the energy bow. This weapon has a plasma generator, which produces a dangerous energy bowstring very similar to the energy binders that link pod racer engines together. Except this bowstring is a lot better at cutting things in half. Now, when this beam is stretched and released through an emitter, it separates the plasma into a solid bolt, which fires out of the weapon like a projectile, or like an arrow. Now again, this is an extremely cool weapon, just like the holdout pistol and the lightsaber rifle, but again, I have to ask, why are we using this thing? Why have your bowstring be a dangerous stream of energy that can literally injure you? I mean, even with practice, that string is hovering dangerously near your arm. And in the middle of a battle, who knows what will happen to you? What if you trip? I mean, what if someone runs into you or tries to, bash you in the head? One bad move and you lose your arm. Also, why use a bow like this at all? It's harder to aim, has a slower firing rate. You also have to stand exposed when firing. You can't really shoot this from like a prone position at all. And even if you do have increased damage, there's no way this hits harder than a bowcaster. Hey! The real reason the Night Sisters use this weapon most likely is because of their traditional culture and rejection of outside technology. Such stubbornness is not a luxury these witches can afford, especially after they piss off the Separatist droid army by trying to assassinate Count Dooku. Against modern blasters, the energy bow is severely lacking. One of the most common weapons utilized by guard units in Star Wars is the electro staff. I mean, everyone from Royal Guards to the IG-100 Magna Guards seem to use them. These long staff weapons were the perfect defensive melee weapon against shorter-reaching lightsabers. But what I never understood is why place electrically charged tips on these things? Yes, apparently if you hit a living being with one of these things for long enough, like 5 seconds, you can stop their hearts, but when do you have time in a melee battle to do something like this? I mean, think about it, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's like way too long. I'm also not wearing pants. I mean, electro staff does make sense for like crowd control or, if you want to neutralize a hostile person and not kill them. But since when did Palpatine or Grievous want his guards to just neutralize people? They wanted their enemies dead. Plus, melee battles are tough enough, and striking your enemy before they strike you is really just a crapshoot half of the time. And with an electro staff, when you finally get that hard-won strike on your enemy, all you really do is burn them a bit and shock them. I feel like that's not enough. Melee weapons should be able to maim or disable a person just by touching them. At minimum, you should have a cutting edge or a vibro blade of some kind. I mean, how many times do you see Jedi get hit by these staffs during the Clone Wars, recover, and then kill their enemies? It happened quite a lot. And so I guess the general rule here is don't bring a non-lethal weapon to a serious battle to the death. I'm simply not a fan of the mighty DC-15, or as the troops call it, the DC. Yes, it looks exactly like an MG-35, and, that's sort of the problem. Not because I think it's wrong for Star Wars to base their weapons off of real-world designs. There's actually a cool production story there that actually can trace its roots back to the original Star Wars film and the low budget they had for firearms. It's always been a tradition for Star Wars to modify real-life weapons and turn them into energy weapons. That part's cool. What I don't like about the DC-15 is the fact that it is supposed to be a standard rifle, or at least a battle rifle, for the clone army. And it's also based off a German general-purpose machine gun from World War II. I mean, this thing is 48 inches long. That's almost one Danny DeVito held sideways. And if you believe in their numbers, it's supposed to be 4.15 kilos, which is Actually, surprisingly light. It's about the same weight as some heavier battle rifles, but I don't believe that because this thing is massive. I mean, the MZ-34 was almost like 3 times the weight of that, I think. On the ground battlefields of the Clone Wars, like at Geonosis, where you have a few miles of clear visibility and no cover, a battle rifle like this is going to really reach out and touch people far away in very intimate ways. It's almost kind of central, but how are you going to use this thing in any other environment? Like if you're in the woods, you're going to be knocking over branches, hitting trees with this thing. If you're in a CQC situation indoors, I mean, forget about clearing the door safely. That thing is going to go through the door like 2 days before you arrive there, and your enemy's going to be waiting for you. And same thing goes with boarding ships or getting into vehicles or getting off of vehicles. This thing is a nightmare. It's just way too long. Eventually the Republic would realize this, and the DC-15 carbine variant would be created, and it would quickly replace almost all of the DC-15 battle rifles. By the last year of the war, it was actually quite rare to see the full-size battle rifle being used at all in the field. Next up, we have a weapon commonly used by the Mon Calamari Guard, the Blaster Spear. As the name states, this is a pretty confused weapon. Like most ceremonial guards, the Mon Calamari Guard wielded staff weapons. Since ancient times, spears and longer-reaching staff weapons were always the preferred weapon of choice for fighters. Even though in pop culture the sword and axe are romanticized quite a bit as the main weapon of choice for battle, these are actually considered secondary weapons and require far more skill to use properly. There's a reason when Din Djarin trains that village, or when the Jedi train that village in the Clone Wars, they're teaching them how to use spears. Now, just like in our own galaxy, in the Star Wars galaxy, melee weapons are at a severe disadvantage in most combat situations, unless you're a Jedi wielding a lightsaber and magic. In our own world, Royal Guards generally have modernized firearms that they can use in case of an emergency, and so whatever musket, halberd, or spear they usually can be seen marching around with are basically ceremonial weapons. The Blaster Spear is an attempt to make a aesthetically and culturally appealing ceremonial weapon that can also be used in modern combat. But here's the thing, when you make a device that tries to do too many things, it usually ends up being really bad at all those individual things. I mean, blasters are pretty delicate and have a lot of fine components inside that might not stand up to repeated bashing. On the other hand, rifles need to make ergonomic sense for the shooter to comfortably and properly aim it and, walk around with it. But on a blaster spear, where you usually have a buttstock for a rifle, is a gigantic blade, which means this weapon needs to be hip-fired unless you want to lose your fin. And so this is a relatively hard weapon to brace and shoot accurately. These blasters can fire underwater at a pretty impressive range, which means they should be pretty powerful. But again, judging by how the Mon Cala Guard performed during their civil war with the Corans during the Clone Wars, they really need to rapidly update this design, because it just doesn't work. Look, I know Gamorreans have substandard intelligence. I know they're barbaric and primitive. But these hulking aliens are commonly used as heavies and guards by criminal overlords like Jabba the Hutt. Yet instead of equipping them with blasters, or heck, even a vibroblade would be better, they literally wield a battle axe into battle. There are so many better options that one could use in combat, but apparently Gamorreans culturally gravitate towards such weapons, and so that's what they choose to bring with them on the job. This might be a bit controversial to say, but this is a reminder that not all cultural beliefs are good or should be even respected. I mean, if I ever hire a Gamorrean, I'm going to give him a blaster and teach him how to use it. Although that could be a bad idea as well. The Inquisitores are the dark side-oriented Jedi hunters employed by Palpatine post-Order 66. And like most things in the Empire, they are all bark and very little bite. I mean, if you can't use the Force or are poorly trained, the Inquisitores are kind of deadly and terrifying, but again, for most Republic-era Jedi, these Inquisitores are quickly exposed for what they are. Aesthetically dangerous-looking and scary fighters who actually have very limited combat ability, especially when it comes to their sword fighting abilities. And the Inquisitorius' spinning blade really does reflect their true nature. This blade can be wielded like a normal sword, or like a double-bladed lightsaber, and then there's also the third mode where the circular hilt can also spin the double blades, which creates a terrifying blur of light. That's not only mesmerizing, but also deadly. It can also allow the Inquisitor to fly through the air. Again, this is probably terrifying if you aren't well trained in the Force or how to use a lightsaber, but this is all kind of a gimmick, and it really won't work against a well-trained Jedi or a Sith. A well-trained duelist will move so fast with their blade that you won't need some spinning mechanism to make your blade move like that, and more importantly, they're probably powerful enough in the Force to also leap great distances through the air, so they don't have to suffer the indignity of flying slowly through the air like some dark side Mary Poppins. And there's really one simple reason why this blade is just completely stupid, and that's the massive ring-shaped emitter. It's not even shielded against lightsaber strikes and just makes a huge target. The second you damage this thing, the entire lightsaber usually stops working, and the Inquisitor becomes weaponless. Generally speaking, the best swordsman in Star Wars should be able to disarm most people with a simple stick, and so when you see a really complicated, flashy setup like this, it usually means this individual is trying to hide some deficiencies.